for punishment, or it's almost Lent or something like that. But someone left their glasses last week, last time we met, so they're up here.
Our first grade teacher.
And the first assessment question is, can the person see? Can the person hear? So everyone get their glasses away. Today we're going to talk about high impact strategies for reading comprehension. And so once again, I'm going to focus on a few general ideas, but mostly about talking about specific things you can do to build student reading comprehension. I'm going to spend a lot of the time talking about a method that's kind of a multiple system called PRREE. I gave you access last time to the CBL lesson plans. You have a site. You'll find when you go to that site, there's lesson plans for a little over 200 novels, young adult novels, using this system. So nearly everything you need to do what we talk about today is something that's either in the presentation or you already have right in your classroom. So I've tried to focus on things where you don't have to go looking for a lot of other things. There are a few initial reading decoding things where some of those helps can be useful, but today is going to be a lot of things that really involve more how you talk to a student about what they just read than anything very specific you have to use. All of the material is in the slides. There's two sets of slides today. One called Reading Comprehension, excuse me, and one called PRREE. They're in two presentations because it's about 200 slides each, so we're trying to... I'm going to be showing the second one a lot of actual classroom examples of some of these strategies in use that I have pictures of. In addition, in the readings, in the material posted for this week, there's about 30 worksheets that go with this. And these are actual student worksheets in Microsoft Word that are kind of the strategy sheets you would use with a student. And they're set up so that you can have the student you can either print them out or the student can simply open them on their iPad and actually work on them right there. So you'll see that for most of the strategies I talk about today, everything you need to do is in the folder. You just need to find a book to do it with, and most of these are generic strategies that will work with just about anything, any chapter book you're working with, or even some picture books, okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about 5 high utility strategies today. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about, we talked about the reading wars last week, and that whether you think about reading from a top-down standpoint or bottom-up standpoint, it's really about getting fluent reading and comprehension. Because those are our two big goals. Whatever else we do with the students, sometimes we get so caught up in the details and the particular things we forget. We really are just trying to go for two things. We want the student to be able to read fluently, and fluent reading can lead to comprehension. Now, what's the problem if you don't read fluently? By the time you get to the end of the sentence, you forget what was at the beginning, right? And so until you get to a certain point of fluency, it's really hard to comprehend because you just can't keep enough of it in memory together at the same time. And then once you comprehend, well, why is that so difficult? Well, here's the reading reality. We know that we have to get fluent, we have to get phonics or sight, and the ability to use multiple cues. And comprehension's about knowledge, vocabulary, and strategies, all three of those things, which is what today is going to be about, is how you actually do those three things. But let me tell you what the problem is. Comprehension isn't really reading the passage, it's thinking the passage. So how many times have you been told in a class, read chapter 3, and you read it, your eyes make contact with every word in the chapter. You have no recollection of it. It just sort of went by you because maybe you're doing 5 other things. Remember, we all learned early on, particularly in college classes, that you're not really being asked to read it, you're being asked to think it. You're being asked to take it, do something with it, and get it into memory so you can use it. And that's why reading comprehension is difficult, because it's really a thinking activity, and anything that gets in the way of your cognitive processes makes comprehension difficult. So it depends primarily on 2 things. Your previous knowledge, what you bring to us. Frank Smith is a famous reading teacher who once said, reading comprehension is what's still there when you turn out the lights. Okay, so it's all this thought that you're already bringing to it, and then that comes into contact with the text. Now, you know, in California, in general in teaching English, we talk about something called intertextuality. And intertextuality is the idea that when you make meaning out of a text, when you comprehend, what actually happens is there's an encounter between your life and experience and that text. And meaning is in that space in between. That means no two people ever read the text the same way, because your experience of it may be very, very different. So I may be reading an article. I can give you an article on Quebec. How many of you have been to Quebec? Beautiful place, right? Ever lived in Quebec? I taught in Quebec. And as a guest of the Canadian government, like if you're a Catholic school teacher in Canada, the government pays you. But, so I'm at this place. Now, when I think of Quebec, I probably think of it very differently than you do. When you think of Quebec, what do you think of?
French
speaking. Great food, beautiful place, Quebec City, Montreal. I was on Lake St. Augustine in Notre-Dame-de-Foix, which is a little village in a very poor part of Quebec that was more like Appalachia than our picture of Quebec. And so when someone says Quebec, I love Quebec, but I don't think of probably the same pictures you do. So here's the thing. The picture, the ideas we bring to a text have everything to do with how we interpret it and look at that. And so that meaning gets created in between. Many of us grew up in the days when we were told there was a correct reading of a text, an ideal reading of a text. I remember in college having Hugh Richmond was then a very famous Shakespeare scholar. I remember him coming to class the first day and saying, I am going to teach you the correct way to read Shakespeare, my way of reading Shakespeare. He was the editor of the Penguin Shakespeare. And then I quickly realized there were lots of ways of reading Shakespeare besides his. And his was even a little suspect. But here's the thing. We create that meaning. So the first thing we want to understand today is, for each of our students, they bring everything they know, experience, think already to the text. They create meaning in between, which means when I'm teaching something with the class as a whole, everyone's having a different experience of the text. They're bringing what they know about it. And sometimes the problems people have with a text isn't really the text itself, it's they have nothing to bring to it. You're completely unfamiliar with it, you have no idea what we're talking about. So if you're a student reading a text, you're just kind of like, what is this? We could pick up a copy of, neuropsychology, whatever, and we could go find something at the medical bookstore, and we quickly find okay, this is all about the surgical techniques for taking out some very specific part of the brain, and I have no idea what any of this is about. And yet a surgeon would read it and get it right away, right? So we see right away, here's the thing. What's in long-term memory has a way of making it to working memory. We'll have something that's called short memory. Reading comprehension is a memory fest. Repeat that. Reading comprehension is a memory fest. It's all about taking what you already have in memory and encountering the text with it, but that's all having in working memory. Here's the problem. This is unlimited. This is very definitely limited. You can have 3 to 7 chunks of things floating around in working memory at a time. And what happens when you don't think about something for a while? It's gone, right? You're doing something. Maybe you've had that experience when you're cooking. I've been banned from the kitchen as a result of the experience. But you start one thing and forget another, and there's a fire going on in the corner. Oh, I forgot about that one. I want you to think about students when they're reading. So what happens when you try to multitask while reading? Does that help or hurt? Hurt. It cannot help. Now, I know lots of people tell me, I can multitask, it's no problem. And I believe that you may have learned to do many things simultaneously poorly. But if you want to do something well, then you need to change your attention to that. And our research in neuropsychology says the human species has not adapted in any way that gives you more working memory than we had 20 years ago. And actually, some of you may suspect you have a little less than you had 20 years ago, but that's, again, another story. What I want to understand here is that for students, the very first thing I need to do when I teach someone, when I work on someone's reading comprehension, is get them to stop everything else. Focus. Read the text. Stop multitasking. Put your phone away. Turn the TV off. Turn the music off. You know, we have this idea that, well, the more stimulation, the better. No, actually. It's in reading comprehension where it breaks down the most. And that's what we see happen is, well, sometimes when someone does it, I say, well, what else were you doing when you read it? Because, see, reading requires you pull this up, you take this in, you combine it, and you're grasping all these things. Well, you overload your working memory very quickly when you're reading. And the less familiar something is, the more difficult. So before we even get into the fancy techniques for reading comprehension, the first one is you will comprehend better if you just read. And you don't attempt to do everything simultaneously. Now, I know kids will tell you, well, I have to have music, and you watch them study, and, well, now you know why. They are the problem they are. Okay, so I want to stop for a second and focus everyone on the idea. There's a myth that kids today are better able to multitask and handle many kinds of memory. This is not a generational issue, it's a neurological issue. And in simplest terms, kids today have no more ability to do that than we did. If you are distracted, you have less memory available. And the result of being distracted is you have less memory available and you'll be more stressed by what you're trying to do. What happens when you have too many things to do at the same time?
You don't do any of them well.
You don't do any of them well. And what happens after like half an hour though? Do you ever find like you want to become violent? Well, in a way you can become violent. But you know, you really feel like, okay. And what's literally happening is when our circuits get overloaded, that's a major cause of stress. And our bodies are reacting to that. I watch kids in the classroom sometimes, and I see that's actually what's happening. They're getting overloaded with everything. So we could do an experiment. I could put you up here, we'll crowd you in, we'll give you an assignment, we'll make it difficult, I'll keep interrupting you, I'll make sure other people interrupt you as well, we'll turn on the heat. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, so you see that the environment, that's kind of the hardest thing for someone to realize is, one of the ways I can help you read is by learning just to study in a way that will let you focus on what you're doing. If you just read and you just focus on this, you will get a lot more information a lot more quickly, especially if you understand that what you're trying to do is take what you read and put it into long-term memory. That this is really about thinking about it. So I mentioned some sources last week, I'll come back to them, but I remember that pretty much everything I talked about today is either in one of these two basic reading texts, or these two strategy texts, or as I mentioned, my favorite, which is this is my favorite cookbook for over 151 reading strategies. And as I recommended, it's something I think every school should have available in the faculty rooms so teachers can consult when you get to it. And I'm going to give you my quick guides to these. So, comprehend. You know, the Center on Instruction did some famous research on what reading comprehension is. And they said it involves students being able to do 6 things, and you need to teach them to do these 6 things. That was at the end of 40 years of argument among researchers about how to teach reading comprehension. And there, you'll see there's a paper, it's called the Center Instruction Guide on Reading Comprehension, is the key summary of the research on reading. And what it said is, the 6 things you need to do if you want to improve someone's reading comprehension. Now I'm going to introduce the 6, but what we're going to do is we're going to learn 5 strategies that do these 6 things. But it's sometimes helpful to think about what you're trying to do. The first is to activate prior knowledge. You've got to get what you already know up and running so you will store it correctly. Have you ever been thinking about someone else, someone talks to you about something, and then you store it with what the topic of the conversation was and you can't remember it later? Most of the time, when we can't remember something, it's not that we can't remember it, it's we can't find it. And you know how you think about it for a while, all of a sudden, 3 in the morning you wake up and, oh, it's, because your brain keeps searching for it and eventually finds it. Okay, one of the, reading comprehension starts with the mental habit of remembering things in the wrong place, with the wrong other information. We always want to activate prior knowledge because I want to make sure that what I remember gets filed with everything else I know about this. You may remember if you read a cognitive psychology textbook, you heard about proactive and retroactive inhibition and facilitation of learning. Everyone remembers that? I'm sure it was your favorite chapter. But what it says in short, but it's a very important concept. What it says is this: when I go to read something, if I think I already know it, I won't pay attention to it, and I won't know I should remember it. If I think this is new, I may take something I already know and replace it with it. In other words, there's all kinds of things I can do with memory where something doesn't end up being recorded in memory because I've thrown something else out. And it's like, you start throwing things away from your computer cabinet and you realize, oh no, I still needed that. That wasn't the same thing. That's literally what happens in reading. We want to activate prior knowledge so that it gets remembered with what else it relates to so you can go find it later. So when you ask someone about, you talk about the chapter they read, and you realize they've confused two different books. They started to read the story once upon a time. Well, lots of stories start once upon a time. But if you read that and think you already know the story, you're going to revert to the story you already know. Sometimes it's really helpful just to say, no, this is new. This is something else. The second thing we need to do is use graphic organizers. Many of the handouts I have for you are different graphic organizers you can use with reading. Graphic organizers are really critical for reading comprehension because they're extra memory. A graphic organizer is like having an extra brain available to you when you work. So I want you to think about what's happening. I'm reading this book. My memory's full. I'm getting frustrated. I'm trying to hold on to things, but in order for me to keep them in working memory, I have to keep repeating them. I could also just add to my memory, because on this piece of paper with the graphic organizer, when I organize it in visual terms, it supplements my memory. It's like a tool for my memory to use at the same time. It actually frees up memory for me to use for other things. That's why they're so powerful for reading. So the next time, if someone says, well, we don't need a graphic organizer, my answer is always, actually, we do. Graphic organizers are great because they basically extend the amount of working memory you have available. I'm going to show you some very simple diagram forms because I like forms that are so simple that a student can just draw them themselves anytime they want to do them, so that they can learn very quickly to hold on to it. So that's one critical thing we can do, is use graphic organizers. The third is to teach comprehension monitoring, pick-up strategies. Now, I'm willing to bet you use comprehension strategies all the time. Ever find you're reading and you realize, oh, I stopped paying attention about 3 pages ago. I have no idea what happened with the last 2 pages. What do you do at that point? Oh, well, go on. No, go back and find out because you realize that's missing. Now, is that something only poor readers do? No, everyone in this room does it. And with age increasingly. It's a reality of memory as we get distracted. That's why we try to cut down the distractions so less of that happens, right? Too many distractions, I can read something and realize I lost almost all of it in the process. So a fix-up strategy is I know to go back, I know how to find it, I know how to figure out what the topic was, I know how to find the last place I actually remember reading, and so I can fix that. A third important part of building comprehension is teaching summarization. Summarization is a really critical skill. I'm going to show you a number of ways of teaching it today. But when I'm reading, I have to take all this data and condense it into something my brain can remember. Summarization allows the brain to hold on to it, because if it stays out there in all that textual detail, no one can hold on to it. What summarization is actually simplification and reduction. You're reducing the text and the words to a smaller number of images you can remember. That's why graphic organizers are often so useful for memory, is because I reduce all that text to a couple images I can remember. The more I experience the text when I read it, the easier it is for me to remember it. Right? So emotion actually supports that reading. The fifth is teach students to answer questions. We're going to spend a lot of time today on questions because this is fundamental to building comprehension. Students learn to ask questions and learn to answer them. Can someone tell me what the 8 W's are? The 8 Ws? Or the 9 territories? Today you'll know them all. Those are the three systems for questions that have had the most actual results in research. And you're going to find out they're so simple you can use them tomorrow. Okay. And the last one is multi-component strategy instruction. Multi-component strategy instruction. That's where you use mental imagery and techniques from across here in a multi-component way to teach reading. PRREE, the last method we'll do today, is a multi-component strategy. And so the major multi-component strategy we're going to teach you is this PRREE system, which you're going to find incredibly simple, actually. It's almost everything in it will be familiar, but it's a particular way of putting them together. All right, so here's the basics of reading comprehension. Remember this chart from last time? And when I was explaining why readability is only a piece of information and not all that useful. And that's what I want to point out. If you're thinking reading comprehension is just getting the right level attached to the student, it's much more complicated than that. Because as I mentioned, these are only suggestive guides to how readable something might be. What we have to do is find ways to work with students that are going to actually force them to do that. So our first critical method for today is called impress. We used to call this neurological impress, but for the simplest terms, impress. It's extremely simple. You'll all be able to use this tomorrow expertly. Let me tell you what it's for. It's for students whose poor reading habits and poor fluency are constantly interrupting their comprehension. Now, so I got on, and it took me around the. Now, what's the problem here? I'm never going to be able to comprehend this because I'm reading it one word at a time. I'm not chunking the words together. So I'm not putting it into meaningful units, and it's so slow and laborious I can't remember what it was. I have no idea what's in that sentence, and I've read this book several times, but I don't know where we're at, and I lose it very quickly. Impress is a method designed to force students out of their bad habits, and it's done in pretty simple four-step process. I pick a passage, and I get 2 copies. You can do this in any book you want. I sit close to the student, facing his or her ear. We read together, but I speak loudly and I speed chunk into his or her ear. So we're reading together, but I'm actually reading faster than you and in chunks to force you to read in chunks and to read faster. And what we find is, you'll find you can do about 5 to 10 minutes of this at a time. At that point, you'll be exhausted. But if you do a short bit of this every day, you start to push this. Now, can you think of a student who you really, we say they're just fluency, but their just fluency in reading is really completely interrupting their comprehension, right? You hear them reading those, one of the can't understand what they read, I can't understand what they read. So the difference would be now it's, I don't know, Iqbal said in a low voice. You could see he was embarrassed, and he wasn't happy that Krim had revealed Hussein's secret. Now that's going to feel way too brisk to you, right? What I'm doing is, by doing that, and I'm literally sitting next to you and I'm talking into your ear. So I'm going to take you as a victim here for a second. So imagine I was sitting on this chair. I would be literally sitting, I might figure out which ear is better for the student. I'm not, I'm sitting uncomfortably close for a reason. I would be actually even a little closer than this, and I would be turned so I'm speaking into your ear. UCLA started to research this at the Neuropsychiatric Institute about 40 years ago. And they found it was the quickest way to move students out of those dysfluencies. Because what's happening is, it's forcing them, and what's happening is you read that, the reason they have to have the text in front of them, they're seeing how you chunked the reading. And you're moving so fast that they can't apply their inappropriate reading skills. So you're right, the student is barely keeping up with you as you do that. That's the purpose, because what you're trying to do is get the student to see the chunks instead of the individual words. And you're trying to build a skill. And when you do that 5 to 10 minutes a day, it's not very long before the student starts to chunk them together themselves. They get the idea. So I want you to think about, can you think of any students you have who don't get this idea? Like, they don't see how, or if they try to chunk it, they put the wrong words together. They don't, like punctuation. Does anyone know why punctuation is important? I taught 9th grade English for a long time to students who were not particularly readers. And I used to start by saying, without punctuation, you'd all be dead. They look at me like you're looking at me. I say, no, really, I'll prove it to you. And then I'd give them a passage from a book, and I took all the punctuation out. And I'd say, now I want you to read this. Now remember, since there's no punctuation, you can't stop and you can't breathe. What happens when you get your punch? You breathe. Can't breathe. Okay, so you have to keep reading, no breaths. Well, most high school students can get about 125 to 150 words before they're ready to collapse on the floor, right? And then all of a sudden they realize you breathe the points of punctuation, it chunks things for you, and actually your life, does anyone doubt that your life depends on punctuation now? You see that you really do have, see what we're doing here is we're helping the student chunk their works, and this is basically to force the student, so it speeds the student up, it forces them past the individual words and it gets them moving. Where do I use this a lot? 5th to 9th graders who are still disfluent are great candidates for this. Because what you're trying to do is push them along and get them, and actually, they mostly think it's a game anyway. And then what do you think will happen after a couple sessions? They speed up and chunk. They start trying to beat you to the punch. At first, they're like, why are you reading so fast? And I say, well, you can either tell them, well, it's to help you, or you can say, well, I have a personality disorder. Whatever you want to tell them. But by reading and doing it, you see very quickly you start to break down some of that. So it turns out this is a time-honored technique that special education teachers have been using forever and is amazingly effective. First, how simple it is. It moves the reader along and breaks bad habits while building connections. And there's lots more about it in this book. All right, second possibility, close. Now you've all done close passages. But you know, we pick a passage, we create a worksheet, and we replace every 7th word with a box or a line, and have the student complete the passage. Now, asterisk here, every 7th, every 5th, every 9th, every whatever. There's different rules for close. Some say you do literally every 7th word. Some say about every 7th word. Some say every 7th word but not proper nouns. You know, there's different applications of it, but the basic idea is that you're taking words out so it forces the student to use context and clues to think the passage. Because when we take certain words out, you're forced to attend to everything around it and try to make meaning. In other words, it forces you to think because it isn't obvious what it is. And so it forces some of those thinking skills to take place. So for example, it's harder than you think. Anyone think this is easy? Well, let's see. You should all be able to read this easily. It's from NCEA. It's their guidelines for what to do every day of Catholic School Week 2017. Most of you probably read it at some point. All right, so let's do it. Celebrate the following daily themes and, in your archdiocese during Catholic schools, week. And it's just, this one's easier to get from now, right? See, because what you see is, you have to really think more of the context. Catholic schools, well, you get the idea here. Now, if you were to look at this here for a second, celebrate the following daily themes and celebrations. You know, we're going to Catholic schools. Catholic schools benefit all year long for religious guidance and so forth. And so what you'd see is, now let's go back. Just, you've looked at it briefly. Catholic schools
Benefits.
yeah, all year long from the religion. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll have the student will read it first. Then I'll give, so I started with this because this was the classic technique. You just give the thing to the students. And I learned quickly with 9th grade boys, this was a bad idea. Because they would get all rattled and angry and so okay, good. So I just do that once. What I do is we read the passage first and go through it. And then as a test of your comprehension of this passage, I have you immediately do this. Because immediately after reading it, now you know what happens when you do this? You end up thinking through the whole passage. So let's just take the first part of it. Celebrate the following daily themes and celebrations in your diocese during Catholic Schools Week 2017. Sunday, in our parish, Catholic schools benefit all year long from the religious guidance, prayers, and support parishes provide. Many parishes join in the National Catholic School Week celebration by devoting a Mass to Catholic education. Schools start the week by inviting parishioners and community members to parish-centered events and school open houses that feature their outstanding academic programs, religious education, and service opportunities. And of course, you're thinking, take out the and, put a comma, and outstanding teachers, period. But now we go back, and you realize this time, okay, Catholic schools celebrate all year long for the moon. And what it does is it forces me to really think what was happening in the passage. So it's an excellent comprehension activity. And the reason I like it is kids are always like, oh, I can do this. And then they're sweating bullets, of course, as you go through here as they try to actually figure it out. And then, oh, let me see that passage again. So you know what will happen? Some of you know where I'm really going with this. I'm teaching them how to do rereading and intensive reading of passages. Because what happens is when they realize they can't do it because they keep going back to find it. And so what they learn is a fix-up strategy, which is to go back and find specific details when you're not sure that happens. Close is very simple, but it forces them into that. So I can take it, now I chose a nonfiction passage, but fiction's easier. The nonfiction to do this with. But I thought Catholic Schools Week would be such an excellent topic for a group. Okay. You see the principle here? Now, how many have done close? Right? Everyone's done close. I mean, and when you pick up tests, they have that all the time. Have you thought about why it worked, though? And what it's useful for? See, oftentimes what I see is people hand it to someone as a test, and what they forget, what you're trying to do is teach close reading of text. You're actually using it. You actually want to give them the text and the closed text together and force them to keep going until they start learning to read closely. Because what will happen is they start learning to read for detail. They start learning strategies to search and find things. And the nice thing about it is it's easy to do. A million of them are available. And you can take absolutely anything you're teaching and create one in a couple seconds. And with Microsoft Word, you can actually do it more or less automatically. So when would you use close? You just asked 3 questions. They told you they read it. Your last 3 questions suggest to you they did not. Or if they read it, they didn't remember any of it. So one of the things I think you're going to see in the PRRE a little later is, I think one thing you want to do is every day take a paragraph and read it intensely. I always like to take a paragraph a day and just take it apart. Just look intensely at how it does everything. So kids begin, that's an amount of close reading almost everybody can tolerate. But if you do it every day, it really develops some good reading skills. And the close is a great way to test that and motivate students to do it. Again, very simple. Third possibility, some reading apps. You know, there's a lot of them. Most of the reading apps available are junk. You already know that. They're ill-conceived and they're ill-executed. So how do you know which ones you would want to use? You might say, well, can't you just tell me 3 that you would use anywhere? And I'd say, well, no, because new ones come out every day. It depends on exactly what you want to do and exactly what you're interested in. Oftentimes, the student's reading difficulty, I'm looking for a reading app that relates to some interests they have. I'm looking at other things. So I want to suggest we want to use apps regularly, but we need a place to look for them. And that would be Common Sense Media. Common Sense Education. This is just a little screenshot of the page where they have the reviews and readings of reading comprehension apps. When you go to the reading page, you'll see they have it broken into a dozen categories, and they have hundreds of apps in each category. So if we were to go, I just did a search, and I told them to put up the ones that have the highest ratings for both users and teachers and their professional staff. And so, example, here are 8 really widely used reading apps that actually are of great use. Light Sail, which measures outcomes. Simple Physics, which actually is kind of a funny way to teach non-fiction comprehension. Bookshare, which is just a digital library that allows you to read aloud. BrainPop, which does all kinds of quiz things. And my favorite, Subtext. Subtext allows multiple students to read together and create. Now, where I want to go with this is this. This is going to be There are detailed reviews of over 600 apps for reading comprehension. I am not going to attempt to go through 600 apps today. What I like about this page is it allows you to tell it what you're looking for and sort. And then you take a little description, you kind of get an idea, what would make sense for this particular student as we do that. Commonsense.org is where you go. That's the specific page for reading comprehension. But I want to suggest reading apps are a tool to do the other things we're doing. Reading apps are not strategies or methods in themselves. They're just automations of strategies. They don't work unless you know what you're trying to do. There are apps that do impress, there are apps that do close, there are apps that do just about everything. As a reading teacher, what you're really trying to do is make sure you understand what you're trying to do when you use it, and there's more discussion of it there. Okay, now let me start getting into some of the real part of this today. So, you're not going to develop much reading comprehension unless you ask and answer questions. Do students develop more comprehension from asking questions or answering questions? Asking, yeah. Asking questions, developing questions is actually harder than answering them. You all know that when you make up a test, right? So first of all, making up the questions is a really important comprehension activity. Sometimes as a teacher I think, oh, I have to make up questions for everything every day. You're depriving students of a great opportunity, which is for a group of students. I have students working, one group's in a rotation over here, another group's working with me. I have this group over here coming up with the questions on today's reading passage that we're going to work with as a group. And they come up with the questions first. Now, you can do this in a number of different ways. You can have the students come up with the questions. You can come up with the questions. You can ask them as you go along. You can use a formula where you ask through a list of questions to make sure you cover each one. I'm going to do that in a minute. You can have the students ask you the questions as you read. I mentioned I had 9th grade boys who were not yet reading. When I got to reading comprehension things, and we were starting to read some chapter books, what I would do is a little daily duel. I would teach them the types of questions, and then every day I would have the questioners. I would sit in the middle, one would sit on each side of me, I would read the text, and at any point, either of them could interrupt me with a question they had based on one of the types of questions we talked about. Well, you know what I discovered happened? It became a lethal game. Because they were looking to see questions I couldn't possibly answer. And then I realized what they were doing was actually getting the book from the library to come up with the questions for the next day. I realized that when I got all these eager volunteers, and I realized they were ready to nail me with these questions they could barely understand about the hyperlinguistic potential, or come up with. But what you find out is the questioning process itself becomes really important. But what questions do you ask? Okay. Does anyone doubt that asking or answering questions is important for building reading comprehension? We've been doing this forever, right? So why doesn't it work? We don't ask enough questions and enough comments. We tend to ask a lot of literal questions. The tendency for both teachers and students is to ask all these questions about what happened. And that is important, by the way. By the way, it is important. I can remember one day, I was doing this short story by Luigi Pirandello about war. It's called War. And this woman's sitting on the train, and she's talking to this guy who's talking all about how wonderful it is to die for one's country, and so on and so forth. And her husband has just gone on to the front. And then in the midst of it, at the end of the story, all of a sudden this man realizes that the son who he loves is in fact dead. And it's not just his glorious death, he is in fact dead. He's not coming back. And the man dissolves in the middle of that. And I realize when I do that story with kids, I have to make sure they get like, the son died. Right? Because the story doesn't make any sense unless you realize that he's talking about this in very philosophical terms until he realizes he's really talking about his son's death. And it has some emotional meaning. Well, I've done them in 10 kids, and all of a sudden I realized literal questions can be very important. Like, what happened? He's talking about his son who is in fact dead. Otherwise, you completely miss the point of the story. So that is important. Did you ever have a discussion go awry in class and you realize we didn't come through the story with the same facts? someone missed something really critical, and so you're getting odd responses for whatever it is. Okay, so what's the remedy? Lots of types of questions. So I'm going to give you 3 lists today, and there are worksheets for each of these 3 in the package you have. But the first is the 8 W's. Now, we all know who, what, when, where, why. Actually, this list says, let's go a little further. I go through a story, I ask a who question, a what question, a where question, a when question, a why question, a how question, a what if question, to hypothesize something that didn't happen, a we should question, to talk about a value question or what we should do, and a we often questions to look at how this relates to my daily life. Now, this may seem, so I want you to look through the list for a second here. I like to keep these on a bookmark, because then I'm reading, talking to the class. You know, you can just go down the list and start asking questions on the spot. Right? Once you've taught them, I mean, think about novels you've taught a lot of times. I mean, you know, you can do this in your sleep. What you want to do is avoid what will tend to happen, which is we just asked down here. This forces me down here. Reading comprehension starts to develop more deeply with these questions. Because you're trying to predict, you're trying to make inferences. Well, what don't you know? Or, well, what did the character learn? What else is happening here? Other things. So this is a very simple list of the 8 W's. Would you turn to the person at your elbow? How many of you know the story of the 3 bears? You all know it. Ask the 8 W's. You have 2 minutes. Ask your partner 8 questions. You don't have to answer them. Ask 8 questions for each W. Okay, listen up. It gets a little more difficult as you move down here. So what's actually happening mentally? When you use these questions, when you try to ask this question, what it's forcing you to do is take the material and keep working it in working memory. And the result of it is you're literally extending and stretching it so that it's more likely to be remembered. You're building extensions from the material, and that's very much what reading comprehension is about. Often, I don't comprehend the text because I didn't do enough with it. I needed to think it out in various ways. So one of the 8 W's is this list. The other 8 W list is the 8 W's of inquiry. And the 8 W's of inquiry are watching, wondering, webbing, wiggling, weaving, wrapping, waving, and wishing. This is a little more cosmic way of doing the text, and the instructions for how to do each one are in the handouts for tonight. But it gives you a way, what we're basically doing is we're taking a text and just doing all kinds of things with it. If you have kids between 4th and 8th grade, they love this. How many of you have done this and seen this before? It's a widely used inquiry method, and it's just taking these and doing creative things with it. But I want to spend most of my time on something that is actually my personal favorite. And this is called the 9 territories of reading comprehension. Now, this was developed by a series of researchers a number of years ago who said, you know, teachers start to ask questions, but they get mixed up when they're trying to ask the questions, and that's why they tend to get so literal. They need a method. So what they suggested is, if you asked one of each of these 9 kinds of questions every day, just one, and consistently did that, student reading comprehension will grow significantly over the years. Now, this method is used two ways, many ways. You can use it with the group as a whole when you're having a conversation. You can use it with individual students. I'm going to take you through the questions it asks, and I'm going to show you the worksheet that you can give the student, and they can do this for themselves. Okay? But it basically asks you to ask a literal question, a structural question, an idea question, a craft question, a literature question, an evaluation question, an inference question, a life question, and a character question. And so we go through here. There's some little bookmarks for this that we have printed you can use, because one of the things I do is I had this printed on a little bookmark with a sample for each question, and give the students, that's what I'd have them keep in their book to hold their place. And they'll tell them, okay, do the 9 territories, come up with your questions. So what are the 9 territories? Literal questions. Ask specifically who, what, when, where, why, or how questions. The first part of what we just did a minute ago, but that's only the first one, is just get some literal questions to establish the facts in the story. Then move to a structural question. Structural questions are ones that have to do with the narrative structure of text, or what we used to call the elements of fiction. What's the setting? What do the characters say and do? What are some of the plot issues? What barriers or conflicts do the characters face? What is the tone, attitude, mood, or atmosphere of the story? So give me just one of those to force the students to think. Now, one of the things to remember about a story is what happens in a story. Stories have a beginning, a middle, and the end, right? What happens at the beginning? You learn about the setting, you learn about the characters, and you learn about the problems the characters have. That sets up the conflict. What happens in the middle of the story? The problems get worse, they collide, and they reach a high point where it explodes. And what happens in the end of the story? The conflict resolves, and we learn about how the characters change. And so if you think about it, I like to start by teaching, okay, so let's just look at what's in the structure of every story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what we're doing in structural questions is just taking it apart and looking at it. One of the things I quickly learned teaching reading is, for a lot of students whose lives have no beginning, middle, or end, and whose lives are chaotic, this kind of comprehension is really difficult, because their lives are so chaotic they don't see that things begin. They don't see how that works. Literature can help them work through some of those issues for themselves. And so structural questions are very much the stuff that the formal teaching of literature is about, is taking this part. But I always like, ask a literal question or two, ask a structural question. For each of these structural questions, I have a graphic organizer for every question on these slides I'm showing you in the handout. You want to help them find the setting, you want to help them find the plot, so I have a graphic organizer for each of these in there for you. Idea questions. What values and character traits are discussed? What do the characters learn? What is the story about? What are some of the important themes? So, especially in Catholic schools, we are big on the theme. What did the character learn? What is at the heart of the story? How many have read The Pig Man by Paul Zindel?
Yeah.
The story? I love that story. Story of John and Lorraine. 2 totally irresponsible teenagers who blame their parents for everything that goes wrong in their lives. They befriend an elderly widower who has a collection of pigs, and they call him the Pig Man. He's unlike any other adult they've ever dealt with. He doesn't manipulate anyone. He just tries to be kind and help people. They have access to his house. He has a heart attack. He's in the hospital. They have the house keys. They're teenagers. What happens next? They throw a party. What happens to the party? His precious things get wrecked. There's a point where John, who's always blamed everyone else for what goes wrong in his life, is standing on the porch, and he sees the pig man getting out of a cab coming back from the hospital and looking at him just at the moment that his friend Norton is smashing the pig man's prized radio. And there's this moment where John says, I realized that I had just hurt the last person in my life I ever wanted to hurt. And there's this classic thing where all of a sudden it's like he has no one to blame but himself. And he realizes at that moment, this of course is the first indication of the theme of the story. And it's picked up about 20 pages later, where all of a sudden, after the pig man's death, John and Lorraine are standing on that same porch, And John turns to Lorraine and suddenly says, you know, our lives will be what we make of them. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's the central statement of theme in the story. But it's a complete juxtaposition to the whole first chapter, where you're just screwed. What happens to you is everyone else. And you see that the characters change completely. Now, because I taught delinquent youth, you can imagine that was a really powerful story for them. Right? Because they're starting the first chapter with John's justifying his delinquent behavior, to his all of a sudden realizing he's responsible. That's the thing. That's the kind of question we're talking about here. But those idea questions are really important. Does the teaching of literature support the values of the Catholic school? It absolutely does and ought to. But if we don't ask this kind of a question, then we don't do that. This is also, by the way, the questions I found that the most disengaged readers, you get into phenomenal discussions once you get to some of those idea things, because you find out once you get into some of those ideas, they are really thinking about their lives in ways we don't often suspect. And it's when we ask the questions that it comes up. So I can tell you, I've had profound discussions of the pig man with 14-year-olds that you would never guess have profound discussions about anything, right? And whose parents couldn't believe it if I told them. But third kind of questions are craft questions. What is the author's style? What does the author do to draw you into the story, to make the story come to life? What special effects does the author use? Imagery, descriptive words, suspense, symbolism, point of view. The craft questions are really about how does the author do what he or she does in the story? Like that passage I just gave you from the Pigman. How is it that Paul Zindel draws you in for the punch when you're on the porch with John Norton smashing the radio and the Pigman's getting out of the car? And the kids look at the way he narrates it in a staccato fashion. And the way he narrates it, you realize, it sets you up so you feel like John sitting on the porch. Because he does it, and you realize the way he writes it, and that's a great discussion with kids to see how you can have such effect just with how you write things. The literature question, how is this work like or unlike any other text by this author? How is it like or unlike other texts by other authors? How is this book related to an historical period or event? So we're going to see, well, what other books have you read that are like this? What, it's interesting the critiques you'll get from kids when they ask that. Okay, evaluation questions. Ask what the reader thinks of the text, author's idea, style, effectiveness. Ask the reader for recommendation. What are their impressions? What are their preferences? Ask them why or why not questions. Do you like the book? Now, would you recommend it to someone? Why not? Do you think it should be on a mandatory reading list for everyone in the universe? Or everyone in high school? Or everyone at St. Patrick's? And you know, it's amazing those evaluative questions you get. What's interesting is the reasons kids will give for why. What do kids typically tell you when you ask them evaluative questions? I hate the book, I like the book. What do you like about the book?
It's fun.
Okay, you hate this book. Why do you hate this book? Why is this the worst book you've ever read? Can you think of an even worse book? I've had great discussions with kids about, like, what's the worst book you've ever read? In fact, well, one Christmas, we decided to all go hunt for the worst Christmas story we could find. Like, the worst. And so we had a worst Christmas story festival, reading these worst stories and evaluating what made them so terrible. The kids had a ball, and believe me, they were terrible stories. Some of the ones they found. But anyway, inference questions. Ask the reader what they think will happen next, or what would or could have happened. Have them make predictions or draw tentative conclusions. Ask them how they know this is a possibility. This is really critical. This is what slaughters kids when they get later. More complex texts ask you to make inferences from the information made, and then that becomes a real difficulty for kids as they move on. The last two, life questions. Ask the reader to relate the text to their own life. What real life situations, problems, decisions, or age issues can they relate to? And the last one are character questions. What positive character traits do you see in the character in the story? More on that in a second. Now, which of these territories do you tend to ask the most? research studies, they found literal questions, sometimes structural questions, a lot of evaluation questions, maybe an inference question, maybe a life question. But you realize, how often do you ask all 9? Okay, so what they found in the research was this. If you ask at least one of each 9 types of the 9 types of question, it significantly increases someone's comprehension text and their strategy. They learn a strategy for taking the text apart. How hard is it to do this? Not at all. So one of the worksheets you'll see just has those 9 STEM questions in the space. Kid pulls it up on their iPad, just fills it in for the day, and does that, or writes new questions for them. It's an easy exercise to do, but you end up with a very focused comprehension exercise. Because a lot of times we get to where we have our text, maybe we have text sets and things we're doing together, but where we fall down is the quality of our questions is poor. And so the idea is comprehension increases with more precise questions. What we really want to do is force the student to think through this over and over again until they get some parts of that. So, let's do this. The 3 little pigs, that's another story, you know? Would you ask a craft and a literature question to the person next to you about the 3 little pigs? And I'm going to talk about the 3 little pigs in a second. So 1 minute, talk to the person at your elbow. I would ask a craft question. Let me interrupt you for a minute. One of the ways I teach this is a lesson I've done with 3rd graders and a lesson I've done with high school students. In fact, I've done it with kindergarten kids. Is I use 3 versions of the 3 little pigs. So I use a traditional version. I use Bobby Salinas' Peacemaker's version of the 3 little pigs. And I use the true story of the 3 little pigs by a wolf. That's the one where he and so we read, after we've done all 3 of them, then I ask them, okay, what is the author's style? What does the author do to draw them? And what we do is we compare those 3 stories. And we see that each author does it in a totally different way, both with the artwork and the story itself. And they're really interested, one of those that they're really interested in is how different the wolf is depicted in the 3 stories. And so they start looking at, how is this like other texts by this author, other books you've read? And then they start talking about other stories they've read that are similar in doing that. So oftentimes it's by taking similar texts together that we can really develop some complex questions with the comprehension. Often with older kids, I will use picture books for this purpose. The text is simplified, but it forces them to actually learn to think this way. Because oftentimes what happens is they're getting lost in the text itself. And their fluency is getting in the way. And what I really want to do is develop the comprehension skill so they can bring it back to the text and understand what they're reading. And so we see that these become really important questions. Now, the idea behind this technique is actually pretty simple. It's to think and rethink and think about a text and keep exploring it. But the alternative oftentimes is, have you ever been in a freewheeling discussion of the text where everyone's talking but you're not sure we're really talking about important things about this text? And this helps us keep it focused. Oftentimes I'll do this with students by, you can take those questions, cut them up into slips. As you walk in the door, just hand them out randomly around the room. Each student has a different territory. And then during the discussion, they're responsible for asking the questions on their territory and leading that part of the discussion. We say in blended learning that we want to increase student control over the time, place, path, and pace of instruction. And that's one of the ways we do that, is by giving the student ownership of the lesson and doing that. Often we think, very Catholic school teacher-ish, we're supposed to do everything. We're supposed to prepare everything. We want to remember that sharing the joy gives students the opportunity to learn in a number of those ways. This is a list of positive character traits. When I ask the character question, I typically ask them to think about some of the characters and which of these positive character traits you'd say they have. And what they did, what actions they had that told you, that led you to believe that they have these traits. This is again where the agenda of the Catholic school and reading come together well. Because we call positive character traits, well, we have another word for it in the tradition. How many of you went to ethics camp? Virtue. Virtues are good habits or positive traits, and we can have a discussion about, what is a good person like? How is this character being a good person when they do this? And we can talk about some of those things. So we want to see that reading comprehension allows us to do a wider range of things, but it's really getting students to think more deeply about the text. Sometimes we think reading comprehension requires a lot of special materials or worksheets. Reading comprehension works with whatever text will engage the student. With kids who don't have difficulty reading, one of the things I used to do is I used to keep a stack of magazines, every kind of topic in a magazine you can imagine, and just leave them out on the table and have students stand and see which ones the student picked up. And then I had a little guide to some young adult literature on the topics that magazine covered. So if they picked up Sports Illustrated, or they picked up Teen, or they picked up, whatever they picked up would give me an idea what they might be interested in reading about. Do you read at the same level when something interests you than when you don't? So you realize matching students to their interests is really important as a way of doing it. Again, you can find more information on that there. I want to spend a lot of time today, though, talking about a technique called PRREE, prepare, read. What else? Have you ever seen this before? Well, I'm going to go through it at some length in just a second here. This came, I mentioned Gail Tompkins' work. Gail Tompkins led a movement in reading nationally, in California in particular. We had in successive years had a back to basics movement where we believed in phonics first as the only way to teach reading. And then we went to whole language reading. We went from one extreme to the other. And she led a movement to say, we need to find a place in the middle that balances that. And so the notion of balanced reading is actually a term she created. She's kind of the approach to balanced reading. PRREE is a balanced reading approach to teaching comprehension, where we take a novel or a book we want to use, and we use that as the focus for developing all these different comprehension skills together. This is a method that can be used with the class as a whole, that can be used by individual groups or individual students within the class. The CBL materials you have access to are individual lesson plans that follow this for 200 and something novels. And I'll talk about some of those novels. So you have all those materials, and so it has a lot of those materials developed for you. We also have a version of the CBL that's designed entirely for students to do on their own, through independent study, or for parents to do with students if they're, say, on homeschooling. Those being some of the audiences there. Before I put up the PRR information, though, let me ask you a question. What are the things you do in the classroom that you think make the most impact on student reading comprehension? What things have you found are most impactful for developing student comprehension in the classroom? Would you turn the person to your elbow? I'm going to give you 1 minute. What would be the top choices for you? Alright, if I'm gonna focus this way. I'm going to introduce PRRE through the Character-Based Literacy Program. That's the Santa Clara University Markville Center for Applied Ethics Program. Full disclosure, I'm the author, but I spent 20 years of my life developing this thing. But that's why we have so many lesson plans for so many novels that we've developed over the years. And as a teacher in the Diocese of San Jose, you have free access to all the lesson plans and materials. That's why you got the password. CBL is the idea that, first of all, you want to teach things around organized themes. And the themes it teaches around, there's one for each quarter. We connect them on a daily basis. The themes like responsibility requires action, change requires effort, leadership requires engagement, justice requires restraint, courage requires fortitude, integrity requires wholeness. Anything come to mind? This program is used in both Catholic and public schools, so there's a reason I write them the way they are, but does anyone recognize where they come from? Ever heard the cardinal virtues? Read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, go back to Thomas Aquinas. Actually Aristotle first developed them. Remember, a lot of you have talked about the cardinal virtues, which are prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, right? So this is really just a program. So the program is organized around virtues, so the questions in every novel, so it should play well in a Catholic setting. The two biggest users of the program are juvenile hall and alternative school programs and Catholic schools. So those are the two big audiences for the program. It's used in 38 of the 58 counties in California in their juvenile facilities and alternative schools. It's used by 17 dioceses. It's in a lot of places. And it's a state program for Alaska, so they have, so different places use it different ways. So you can see examples. One of the first things we do is we rely heavily on using both visual and oral language to build reading comprehension. So you can see examples of ways that schools will put it up on the walls of their classrooms and come back every day to the theme. The idea here is that if you want to really build thematic instruction understanding, you have to be clear in the themes you're working from. And we're in Catholic schools in a perfect place to come up with a way of support some of the ideas of the school across it. These are ones I propose because they fit well with our notion there. We have cycles of books. These are the middle school books, but we have a middle school and high school program. Our high school books would be your middle school, and our middle school would be your upper grades. Because the list that's primarily public, alternative, and juvenile hall programs. So they're doing a great deal of young adult literature at the high school level because their kids, they're kind of busy doing something else when their friends were reading the books earlier, so we look at that. But you can kind of see, look to see, for instance, any of these books you use in the school? Yeah, so you'll find the complete lesson plan. How many of you have looked at the lesson plans for this before? You'll see they're pretty substantial. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. So the first thing I want to say is I want to talk about the method. The lesson plans are designed so that you see how the method gets applied every day when you use the program. If you're using PRREE, there's 11 activities in each daily lesson plan. Teachers take and resort it and use it any way they want. I just want to be clear, It is not intended as to be a prescriptive program. The idea isn't that you teach it literally the way it is, it's that you have the tools to teach it this way if you need them. Why? And then put an asterisk, because a huge group of the users I have are people who teach in juvenile facilities and are not really English teachers at all. They're typically people who've been hired because they can handle the kids, and they never really intended to teach English. So I have to scaffold a great deal to help them in the classroom, because a lot of this is new. So you might look at it and say, does Steve think I'm an idiot that he explains all this? No, but I have teachers for whom this really makes a difference in the quality of their instruction, to have a lot of things explained out, theme questions and other things. So it's not, so you may find it very helpful because things are pretty detailed for a day because, well, as I always say, for someone who's using the program, there are things of ours you'll like, there are things you won't. Hopefully you'll come up with better ideas for many of the things. But at 11 p.m. at night, our program begins to look really, really good. And by 8 o'clock the next morning, we're practically brilliant. Because we've got a lesson for you. And you can always improve upon it, but you know those days where you're just, you leave school, you're exhausted, you really were going to do that lesson plan tonight, and you're just like, no. One more thing, and okay, so that to us has been really important, is to realize there's a lot of work. You know, for instance, one of the novels. Which I love. But anyway, so we have a whole variety of these are the high school books. And so you'll see we have a mix of books that are young adult literature that appeal to kids, classics. We have a number of Shakespeare plays. We have, but everything's taught a little differently. Like Shakespeare is always taught by using the movie version of the book together. And so we do Romeo and Juliet by comparing two different versions, the Franco Zeffirelli and the Baz Luhrmann versions of Romeo and Juliet. And we actually study the character of the prince and how the prince is different in those versions of it. But anyway, so you know, this would be a typical year in the program in terms of the books that would be available. But you'll see that again, there's a 4-year cycle, there's lots of those. You can do that. Go through this. Okay. This is the basic format it's based on, is Gail Tompkins' idea about prepare, read, respond, explore, extend. One of the most systematic ways, and remember all of this is up there for you, there are those copies of this charts if you want any. But this is the basic method. You've all heard that when you teach reading, you should teach into, through, and beyond the text. Okay, so if there's anything research tells us about reading comprehension, it's that it develops when you teach into, through, and beyond the text. That's a formula that's been around for a long time, and it's really critical. The problem is oftentimes we just teach the text. And so we find out that pre-reading and post-reading activities are really critical. But again, go back to Tompkins' research. Tompkins found, so the process should be prepare students to read, have them respond to what they just read, have them explore that reading, and then have it extend to their life in the world. And so you see, we have 11 activities that we use every day. There's one of each of those 11 in the lesson plan. But what I want to focus you on is those 11 activities. Because those are the 11 PREE is basically 11 activities, like groups of activities that build reading comprehension. And your task, whether you work with a student one-on-one or a small group of the class as a whole, is to really build comprehension by doing those things. So I want to show you examples of what it might look like. You know, the first thing we do in every lesson is prepare them for reading by building background. Build context for the ideas, places, persons, or events in today's reading. You know, we always do it. We realize, you know, there's things about the world you need to know to understand the story. But the problem is you can't do too many. Because if you do too many, their memory is full already. And they get to the book, and there's no room. So what we try to do instead is take one key question or theme or content or piece of information for the day that we can teach, and just try to think about what's one thing that if you knew it, this reading would make more sense to you. And then the second thing we do is to create a word wall and to pick some vocabulary for the day to teach. Now, we are particularly interested in generative vocabulary that's permanent and portable. Let me explain. In the Common Core, turn to the person at your elbow, what's the difference between Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary? What's the difference between Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 vocabulary?
Tier 3 is the level. Tier 3 is the level one. Tier 3. And one is the lowest one.
Okay, so years of vocabulary research finally led researchers to say, when you look at vocabulary we teach in schools, it's either Tier 1, which are words that everyone knows, no one needs to be taught unless they're an English language learner, in which case they wouldn't have those words. Tier 2 words are the words you use every day that are important, that are generative, you can create other words out of them. And so if you knew those words, you'd be able to use them and you'd have more word power. Tier 3 words are discipline-specific words. They're words you wouldn't try to learn, you'd look them up, or you'd figure them out from context, because they're very specific, they're SAT words. And a lot of times people teach words because they're going to appear on the SAT without understanding. Vocabulary tests are based on something called item response theory, IRT. That is, the less likely you are to use a word, the more likely it is to end up on the list. Because it tells you, because if only a few people know it, it's better for discriminating the scores, but it means it's of no real use to you for instructional purposes. The big change is we teach generative words that you want to be able to hold on permanently, and they're portable. You can use them anywhere you go. So what we want to do is look at the words a day and be selective. No more than 5 words in a day. So typically we want to teach 3 to 5 new words each day that you're going to be able to use lots of places. And so what we do is we avoid words you already know, and we really avoid words that are discipline-specific that you really can't. You can look them up if you need them. We want the words you're really going to use, and so this has been a big shift in the Common Core. The way we do that is by adding them to a wall. You've probably mostly done word walls. I'm going to show you lots of examples from classrooms with these novels. We propose 5 words each day that are generative Tier 2 words that are worth teaching, and the way we teach them is by having students use them in as many ways as possible. Janet Allen wrote a famous book called Words, Words, Words,
Yes.
in which he talks about dozens of ways of teaching vocabulary. And so I'm a great fan of using various of her techniques with the words each day, but I mostly just sort of throw them out, buzz on them, use them together in a sentence, use them as many bizarre ways I can. What I like to do is take 5 minutes to have the students use those 5 words as many ways as they can, and to hear each other use the word. It's critical that students hear each other use the words. Why? Well, let me give you an interesting thing. Have you ever gone through the experience, you have a vocabulary list. You introduced it on Monday. They looked it up on Tuesday. They practiced on Wednesday. They did more with it on Thursday. You test them on Friday. And on Monday, they've completely forgotten all 20 words. You've all had that experience, right? And then you're watching a new swear word, a particularly juicy one, has just hit the school. The students have heard it exactly once, and yet every student in the rural school knows it. And you're sitting there thinking, what is this? I just taught this in this intensive way and nobody remembers it. That's because the social uses of language favor its remembrance. When you hear your peers use a word, you're much more likely to remember it. One of the first things I want to remember as a teacher is, yeah, you want to use words, but what you really want to do is create situations where the students use the words and hear each other use the words. And get them up visually, because then what happens is when students are writing and do other things, the words on the wall have a way of getting into their stories. And so you can think of examples of, just with the novels we had, of various word walls teachers have done with our things. So just go around taking pictures of them, from holes, and here's from a book that deals with Chinatown at the turn of the century. You can see this was a book that dealt with the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. But you can see all these different ways that teach. This is the stories of Ulysses, is the Odyssey. These are retelling the Odyssey, and they all have boat races and build things there. and so forth, so. You see they can get quite elaborate. It's like quite elaborate in what we do with it. Now, those are all word walls from juvenile hall classrooms, by the way. And those are all novels that you teach. It's important to do the word wall. We find that when you do the word wall in a creative way and it's up there, there's an environmental print. You see the words, and because you keep seeing them, one of the reasons words, I want you to think about the students in your class who you suspect may have the most difficulty in school. Perhaps they're the people that if you someday heard they were in juvenile hall, you wouldn't be entirely surprised. What do those students do? I want you to think about one of their strengths in learning. Who looks most around your classroom? Your best students or your more problem students? That's the kid who's always looking around, because street skills, kids who have good street skills depend on constant surveillance of the environment. Particularly boys. And you know what happens when you have a word wall up, and see, this is great, see all these up here? They're always scanning the room. They see the word wall far more than your better students. They're the ones who benefit most from a word wall. The reason you always want a word wall up is because so that when kids look up, they see something. Even if you have no intention of learning these words, if you're constantly scanning the room, you may see those words a couple hundred times today. They have a way of getting into your brain that way. So one of the absolute rules we use in juvenile hall classrooms is you've got to have a word wall up, because they have to see those words. And you know what we discovered? The words make their way into their writing almost immediately, if they're up on the wall. Sometimes in odd ways, but let's take what you can get here. Okay, the second phase is...
When do you take the word wall down?
At the end of the novel.
Okay.
So what I do is I start up, and every day 5 more words go up.
Yeah.
And then what I do is I introduce 5 new words, and I introduce a couple, and then I review a couple from before. And then by the end, then what I do after about 3 days is I have the kids take over the word walls and review. Because once it gets started, I put them up, but then I'll put it up and the kid will, or I'll go in the classroom and I'll just hand them to kids. And then when I do the word wall, they'll come up and do it. So with middle schools, I'm more inclined to hand them out and have them do it because it gets people on their feet doing this in the classroom. And then they have to guess what the word might mean. And it's funny because they'll start talking about the word, and you'll notice when they start talking around the word, they manage to get it. Because what they do is they watch everyone else's face, including yours, to see if they realize they're getting warmer. So it's kind of an interesting exercise, but you see everyone thinking together through it, and by keep going back to that word wall, again, it gets those words into common use. Vocabulary is critical. Word power is power. And increasing people's vocabulary is one of the ways we build comprehension. So it's really important. So now we're at the read phase. So we've just done 2 activities. I introduced 1 new piece of information to them. We did 5 words on the word wall. They're up there. I'm about 10 minutes into class at this point. So we can actually do things that influence comprehension a lot fairly quickly. What makes them work is doing them regularly. It's by doing the word wall throughout a novel you're reading that it actually has an additive effect, and that's really what makes a huge difference. So now we're in the read phase. In the read phase, the first thing I do is review everything we've read in the book so far. And to review that, we use something called a timeline. Now, a timeline is simply a chronological timeline of the events of the story. In an activity in a moment, we're going to add a couple of events to today's timeline. But when we teach reading comprehension, what we do is we take, every time the student picks the book up again, we take them through the timeline of what's happened in the book already. Because what it does is it reinforces the chronology and this idea of beginning, middle, end. Have you ever been teaching a book and all of a sudden you're forgetting exactly what happened, where, and when? I find as a teacher it's incredibly helpful to review the sequence myself to make sure that I've got it in the right order. Have you ever had students be absent from a lesson? When they come in on the timeline, they get caught up on what happened while they were gone. And what happens is after a while, the students start to put it together. Now, and then I go back to the beginning and review every day to where we are in the story. That's a critical skill for building comprehension. So we know that timelines and building the chronology of a story is really critical, because oftentimes with more complex works like chapter books we read, where students are unable to comprehend is they have forgotten key details of the story, or they didn't seem important to them when they happened. But what's really great is you go back from the timeline and then remember yesterday's events, and all of a sudden they see how something early in the story foreshadowed what's happening now. Or they see that, oh, actually, this isn't the first time that happened. And it's really fascinating because you'll see students all of a sudden, things barely sit in their seat, or they just put together how something relates in the text. So these are some timelines from classrooms. This is where a student is going all over the United States putting whirly gigs. Now you can see these are mostly student-generated timelines. We put the student in charge of putting them up. Some can be very simple. Some are much more complicated. This guy's in jail, obviously. Here's Kindred, which is a Civil War novel. It's much more complicated. You notice they found pictures for everything to go in here. Sometimes they get more complex in terms of what they do, and so forth. So you'll see there's just some examples of different ways that students have done it and can do it. So typically you notice we just do about 3 to 5 events for each day's part of it and keep reviewing it. Students can also create these entirely on their own and do them, and so forth. Now, what I want you to think about for a second, this is from Blood Red, Under the Blood Red Sun circuit. What happens when you're doing the timeline? You're getting the sequence down. How many times have you worked with students where you see that it's their inability to work with sequence that's undermining their reading? And so you figure out I'm a true believer in timelines, because that lack of sequence is what sinks students. The story doesn't make sense to them because they can't sequence it correctly. They got out of order. And you know what favors that? If my life is chaotic and I don't really see a beginning, middle, and end, I have enormous trouble with sequencing. Have you dealt with parents where you realize there's significant problems in the parents' lives, and like the sequence thing, the orderly thing, that's a problem for the whole family as a result of it? Interestingly, we now know that you can help people through that by helping them learn to do sequencing and things in reading. That is, as you learn to develop some orderly mind habits, it has a way of transferring to other parts of your life. And so there's a bigger value to this than just the fact that, although it certainly helps with reading comprehension. Okay? So, I've reviewed the timeline. Now we're going to read. You know, reading for comprehension, which is higher, your oral comprehension when someone reads to you, or your reading comprehension when you read yourself? Usually your oral comprehension is about a year ahead of your actual reading comprehension. So if a competent, proficient reader is reading and you're following in the text, you will read far better. One of the things we want to do with students who have comprehension difficulties is have them reading with a tape where they hear a competent reader who's phrasing and chunking and doing all of these things, because it helps them learn to comprehend. Because the problem is often they're not fluent readers, so when they read, what happens? They or a peer reads, and it's so butchered that they can't comprehend it because you couldn't comprehend it if that's what you heard either, right? So books on tape and other things are a great tool for helping to build comprehension. Remember, sometimes we say, well, yes, for decoding instruction, we want them to read the text. But on comprehension, we want them to learn to think through the text. And if the reader isn't fluent, they're not going to be able to put the text together until they hear what it sounds like when it is actually read proficiently. So remember that I may do things, I'll read the text to the class. Some things I always like the tape, like Vincent Price doing Edgar Allan Poe, beats me every time. I just can't do that. But, and sometimes I have books where they're actually read by the author. like, there's nothing like hearing Night read by Elie Wiesel himself, because his voice, when he talks about certain of those episodes, is just, you know, it just gives you a whole different take on the text. So sometimes an author reading of a text can be really useful to you, but it's getting a good reading of the text. Often I'll read it and I'll stop about every page or two to ask some questions. Now, why, you might think, well, why not just read the whole thing through? What I've discovered is people have difficulty reading. They tend to lose their attention about every page, page and a half. So I'm actually stopping to ask a question to get them back on task. So remember, if the reading is extended too long before the reader does something, with students with reading comprehension, that may sink them right there. So breaking it up is really a useful skill. So instead of waiting to the end to ask the questions, you might want to have, okay, at the end of each page, stop and ask one of the W questions.
For students that are listening and reading, George Plimpton is an actor. He's reading Charlotte's Web.
Yeah.
Love his voice. He sounds like a farmer, and he has a farmer kind of. He's an actor, but I just really enjoyed it. I mean, I read Charlotte's Web, but to hear George Plimpton read it with that kind of farmer voice, it's just really lovely.
Yeah, you know, you get particular books where the reader just makes it and
Yes,
you get a
he
hold of
does,
it. Now, especially for a student who has trouble with reading comprehension, that makes all the difference in the world because they get it now. They understand what's supposed to be happening when they read the book. Another example is, I'm trying to remember who the author is who does the reading of 1984 for Audible.com, but the way he reads it, as though the book isn't terrifying enough. But I'll tell you, by the time he gets to reading it, you're literally crawling under your sofa during parts of the story because it becomes so alive as you hear these voices. Okay, you see, that's one of the experiences we want students to have, because students have difficulty with comprehension, don't get the joy of the text. And one of the reasons why we read is we have that experience. And we know that this text can be like traveling in your head. And until the student gets that, there's little reason to work on your reading comprehension. Once students have that experience, particularly when it's a book that they have to know what's going to happen next, and you know they're really engaged with that, which a lot of these books are. So reading is really important. That brings us then to the response section. The first thing we do is we do that timeline. 3 events, 5 events, 7 events, whatever it may be, and then we add to the timeline each day. Then we do something, you notice this is heavy on the visual. Students who have reading comprehension difficulties often are more able to process oral or visual text, information. So having activities that are heavy on oral and visual really do help those students. So I like to use a continuing graphic where they have a set of directions and they add every day. So for instance, a map. Here's some examples of maps we've done in a classroom. Now, with maps, sometimes I'm doing an actual map and following them. You've read The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez. In The Circuit, the family is actually moving up and down California during the story. And so I use a map of California to see where they are each day and what's happening there to follow them through. I was doing The Circuit with the students at Ventura County Juvenile Hall. And we got to the last day when the Immigration Service arrives and arrests the family and detains the family. And I have this group of kids in the classroom, and I'd forgotten going in just how real that issue was to a lot of the kids. And they were besides themselves. So I had to get Francisco on, he's a professor at Santa Clara, so I had to get him on the phone, say, well, actually it turned out okay. And so I got him, and I taught his kids in high school, so he owes me one. But anyway, so he got in and he explained that, and I said, well, I know for a fact he's still here, and I actually have taught his kids. And they were so genuine, he came down to visit them. But it was sometimes it's that connection to author and a story, and you see the map brings it to life, because they knew those places. They knew them from other experience, and then it brings us. Sometimes I do the map from inside the story. Do you remember Lord of the Flies? Okay. You know, they are figuring out where they are during the story. They don't know. And so I make a map starting where they are, and I'm adding the details as they learn about where they are. Like when they start, they don't know they're on an island. Right? And gradually this gets flushed out and they bring that together, and then they see it by the end of the story. And they're quite jazzed with that, by the way, when they have this map they've created. So maps are a great activity with the law stories, also because for kids, spatial is often so difficult. They're having trouble visualizing the story. And so once they get the map, they kind of see, okay, now I know where we are in the story. So now what I want to do is I want to extend the story. Now, to extend the story, I first of all want to have an activity that uses language, either visual or oral, and builds the theme. So this is typically where I use graphic organizers within the story. And you'll see that in the materials for today, I have literally dozens of things you could do with this activity section. And what I do is they're all generic. The ones that are in the handouts are just generic activities you could do at the upper elementary level with any story. So from about 3rd to 8th grade, they would, it's just it's the basic format to work with just about anything. So let's give you some examples here. One of my basics is an open mind portrait. How many of you have done this with your students? So an open mind portrait, what I ask them to do is, first of all, draw the character. What do you think the character looks like? Then we put cartoon bubbles around the character of things that character would think or say. And so it creates a really interesting character portrait. So I start by having kids create the open mind portrait, and then as we continue reading, I add additional bubbles as we learn more about the character. And so they're really developing a fairly sophisticated character sketch of the students. And as you see, I can do it as a group, or a lot of them, all these various students up on the wall, and we get into, it tends to turn into competitive open mind portraits. But I think that can be a good thing, because often, one of my problems in reading the story is I can't understand the perspective of the character. Where else would this be a real issue for you, by the way? Students on the autism spectrum? Students who are on the autism spectrum have difficulty forming what we call a theory of mind. They have enormous trouble doing this, and this is the best exercise for helping them learn it. Because precisely what happens in autism is you're unable to anticipate what another person is thinking or feeling, so it's hard to predict what you should do next. I do this to help the person. Now, I raised some nephews and nieces after my brother's death, but one of them was on the autism scale, and this was one of our most common activities, not at night, with what he was reading in school and with the people he had to deal with in school. So I remember one year, we had an open mind portrait of a particularly difficult teacher that we added to every night, so he could try to understand, because he never understood why she was asking him to do all these things that he perceived as crazy. And then he began to see how she saw them, and to realize there was a reason, because from her point of view it made sense, even though from his point of view it didn't. I should tell you, from his point of view, unless it involved paintball, it was of no use. So he had, and he could tell you a level of detail about paintballing beyond. Okay. He's a successful businessman, married with a child today, so. Did you see some examples of the open mind portraits here? Now, you notice, sometimes people think, isn't there a lot of time to do this kind of activity? When you're writing and cutting and doing this, you know what you're doing? You're thinking about the story. See, what it does is engages the kid into thinking about the story far more deeply than they would otherwise. They get kind of caught up while they're doing the artwork, and so it tends to be a great activity for forcing comprehensive thought. Open mind portraits are one of our strategy that really significantly improve the level of detail that kids remember about stories. Often I just have them do a sketch of the setting. What does the setting look like? Particularly if they're, want to do the Odyssey. They're always fascinated by certain things, stories in the Odyssey, Not just the Cyclops, but Cyclops too. I'm always amazed by that was from The Hobbit. You may remember the scene. This kid was really interesting, the level of detail that some of the kids get into here. One of the things we found out about delinquent youth and adults who are in custody, visual art is a way they remember the world that they don't have contact with, and becomes a really important way of thinking through things. And so often, and we found that for many students who are separated from families or there's trauma going on in their life, these activities really help recenter kids. So there's another reason that may be useful. So, again, we have them do newspapers of the story so far. Here's the newspaper, so you can see, now there's specific directions for how to do this, so you can hand them to the kid and they can work on their own. A lot of times, the way we build reading comprehension is by getting a kid to engage with the text more thoroughly and more deeply than they have before. It's not really about the effort you provide, it's about finding a way to get them to engage in the story and do these things. And so having a kid spend some time focused on doing this is really an important activity for developing their comprehension. And so you can do things that are a lot more palatable to the kid. Now here I have a lot of paper and pencil ones, but remember, many of the activities are also set up for the iPad. You create album covers, movie covers, we can do more sophisticated things with graphics, I particularly like that. So again, you see examples of what different teachers have done in their classrooms, or some parts of the story. So these are all different kinds of graphics that were in there and so forth. So now we've done the activity. So we've done 7 activities so far with this particular read on a given day. The 8th is a discussion, which is to prompt in-depth discussion with questions from the 9 territories or the 8 Ws. The 8 Ws required to take one of those. You don't have to use, by the way, I wasn't suggesting you use all 3 of those. I find it's often more successful if you take one of those 3 that you like, either of the 8 Ws or the 9 territories, and consistently use that every day. The consistent use of one of those over the course of the school year will significantly increase student comprehension. And what you'll find is by the 2nd week, it's second nature to you, and by the 3rd week, it's second nature to the kids. They can take those 2 and do them. So we have an in-depth discussion because we want to get that information out. The 9th activity each day is to do an analysis where I like to take a key paragraph and just take one paragraph from the reading and just take it apart, like how does it work, how to do this. So they do a really close reading, but a paragraph is enough to be able to do that without driving them crazy. That's also where I like to look at things like punctuation and a lot of matters of form. Because one of the things that throws kids are things like, well, where do you put the commas? Well, don't bother, we'll just throw them out. Periods, like, well, yeah, you want to create sentences. And that becomes, as they see how that's done, a paragraph's about as much patience as people have for that kind of close reading. So that works rather well. Now we're into finally the extent. How do you extend this into your life, into the world? Well, reading and writing are reciprocal processes. Later I'm going to talk about writing comprehension, but if you want to build reading comprehension, writing every day is one of the essential things we need to do. Because when you write, you're constructing material out of that and coming forward. So we always, you'll see that there's a writing prompt every day that provides a context, a question, defines the product, and the descriptors are tied to 3 different standards. And so we have Common Core standards-based prompts for every single day, and you can take them up or down, re-level them as you wish to doing that. Why is writing important for reading comprehension? Because it forces you to construct a product parts. Remember I mentioned the importance of summarization and getting those details into memory? When you take them out and create a product with them, you sort of re-cement where those things are in your memory. And then finally we close by extending today's lesson to life, to the world, to whatever might make sense to them, whatever theme activities or other things they're going to do. Now, if you look at this for a second, okay, if I want to do a systematic lesson with a group on a novel, I tend to follow this process, and labels are set up every day. Doing more of these is particularly advantageous with students who have difficulty with reading comprehension. Because if you notice, what we're doing is, with a short block of text, we're really doing a lot with it. And so it forces a lot of it into memory. But the point of the PRA is a way that we can take you into and through and beyond the text. But do you notice that each one of those 11 activities serves a purpose for developing reading comprehension? It doesn't require doing all of them. You might, with a particular student, choose, we are doing word walls. This vocabulary is such a difficulty with this kid, we're gonna work on that word wall. Or you just decide, I may not use any of these other things, but we're gonna do a word wall, or we're gonna do these questions every day. So you might do one or two of these things, or you might skip around and realize, this kid, every time we do a story, he can't get the sequence right, the story doesn't make sense to him. And I realized, what his task in class could be? He could be the keeper of the timeline. He could be the person who produces the timeline and reviews it every day. And what I find often interesting is for a kid who is not a particularly good reader, who doesn't necessarily think of himself as a good reader, who none of the other kids think of as a good reader, and who's now the keeper of the timeline. I'm amazed how much energy the kid will end up putting into it, and how it can change the perception of the class toward the kid as explaining the story every day. Right? So we can use to bring out leadership. Each of these, if you read Gail Tompkins' work and others, you'll see each of these 11 is a type of activity that has a strong research background, has a strong base of research that tells us that this works well for developing comprehension. You notice how heavily visual they are. Because here's the thing, when you're developing comprehension, you have to work the text. Comprehending is not really reading, it's thinking. And what we're trying to do is, in a sense, trick kids into thinking more about the text. Have you ever tried to arrange something on a paper and all of a sudden you realize you really have you ever done like the front page of a newspaper? Now you know everything that happened in the school, but when you try to arrange it on a newspaper, you realize how much more thinking you have to do about it. How important was this? What really happened? What are the most important facts to represent? If I were going to use an image, what image would tell us about the story but not unfairly represent it? What if you were doing a newspaper article about today's class? Would you choose a picture of everyone sleeping, everyone escaping through the window, you realize the images can make all the difference in the world. So sometimes a great discussion with kids on comprehension is, what would be some pictures that would really represent what happened today? What are some pictures that would really misrepresent it? Because the other thing I want to teach kids is how to be critical readers of media. So let me comment. Never was it more important that we teach kids to be critical consumers of media. Because so much of what passes for information, in fact, as you know, isn't. And so since kids don't understand the difference between search and research, and often take anything that they come across on the internet as a fact, one of the things what reading comprehension is about? It's really about testing the truth propositions you find in the reading. Because it's not just what does it say, but should I believe this? What is the reader's perspective? Now I want you to imagine which kids are most likely to be susceptible to that. And you often find that there are kids, they're having other difficulties in life, and this can only make it worse. Because if they tend to believe what they hear, or they tend not to believe anything they hear, and so they need to have some way to test out propositions to see whether they really should believe them. So our idea here was, okay, so what's the most important thing to do if time is short? I think some of these are a little more important, critical than others. Like you'll see that I think doing timelines that's a number one. Timelines, word walls, and reading. If I did nothing else, for someone who's having reading comprehension difficulty, I'd be able to improve their sequence, and I'd be able to improve their vocabulary. I keep using the word sequence today. Anyone else know where the word sequence occurs a lot? In the Common Core Reading Standard, it's the most common single word that's used. You'll see that sequence appears over and over and over and over. It's one of the big ideas of the Common Core. And then I think, the analysis and writing is really important. So you can do different kinds of things as you move into this. But you're basically trying to realize that reading comprehension is going to improve to the extent that you review and introduce materials, You read them, you do something to analyze or synthesize, and some kind of writing product comes out of it the other end. You'll see that there's other versions of CBL available to you. The leadership version merges it with social studies content. There's an independent study version, we have some science and other materials. There are a variety of things there. Now, CBL is a tool you have available. If you find it helpful, go ahead and use it. I'm using CBL as an example of how we do PRREE, because I want to be clear. The purpose is not to use CBL. CBL is just some materials already developed using PRREE. The worksheets that you see with today's presentation are all individual activities for one of these elements of PRREE that are just generic for whatever text you want. So whether it's one of those questions or the graph, I didn't cover the graphic organizers as such. You'll see there's dozens of them there. Sometimes I have them do a cube. Ever had students cut out a cube? You'll see there's a pattern for a cube. I have them answer one of the questions on each side of the cube, cut it out, put it together, have all that. It's just a way, it's just a less painful way of learning to do an outline. That's something that happens. For the structure of text things I mentioned, there's a graphic organizer for every text structure you can imagine, character, plot, setting, all of those things are there. So I just want to point out to you, there's a whole wealth of them there. So let me kind of sum up, how do we teach reading comprehension? As you might guess, I have even more slides, but I'm going to leave them alone. They're all available to you when you look at it though. What I'm doing in teaching reading comprehension is I want to teach you to think the text in front of you. And to think it enough that it makes its way to memory and is available to you not only when you think about this text, but when you go to take on other text in the future, because it adds up. Reading comprehension is really a habit of thinking that develops over time. And the more intensely you work on one text, the better able you are to comprehend the next text that you would do and the next one, so that you begin after a while to do that. Some of the best discussions I've ever had is once we get kids comprehending and doing this. Now you can imagine the kids who typically do CBL, this is often the first novel they've ever read, the first essay, and that would be quite typical. But I remember one day having a discussion with some kids who had been in a ranch program for a while, so they'd read quite a few books. And somehow in the conversation with the teachers, they found out that the person who chooses the books is me. And so they wanted to talk to me. And I had this great discussion about which books they thought were great and which books they thought were terrible, and they wanted to know what I was thinking. But you know what was interesting? As soon as we got in the conversation, they discovered that this kid who thought Nectar and the Sieve was the stupidest book he'd ever read, that she thought it was the best book she'd ever read. And this kid who thought Iqbal was stupid, this kid said no. That was like, and as they began to realize, they realized every book that they loved or hated, someone else had a completely different reaction to. And so we had, I think, a fabulous discussion about the books. And then I found myself to ask a question. I said, well, okay, actually what I want to know is, you have very definite opinions about these books, and I think they're great. And as you can see, we have different opinions and so forth, and that's why we read different things. But actually what I want to know is, could we have had this discussion a year ago? If we'd had this discussion a year ago, how many of these books could we talk about? And they all started laughing and said, well, a year ago I hadn't read any novels. I couldn't have critiqued that. I mean, couldn't have, well, I wouldn't use the word critique, I won't quote how they actually said this, but anyway, it was very colorful. And you can imagine, they said, they didn't actually say they disliked the book, they used a much more colorful expression for what they thought of the book. But when they realized, they said, yeah, a year ago, I couldn't have compared any books, and so the fact that you have an opinion, see, that tells me they're now comprehending. Because they could tell me what the books were about, they could tell me what they liked and what they didn't. When you can tell me, I hated this book because I now know that you understand it. And when I loved this book because, and both of those tell me, you know what we ended up talking about, let me tell you some other books you might like, each of you individually, because now I have a sense of what really attracts you to a book. So reading comprehension becomes a permanent habit at the point where I now have preferences about what I like and I don't. And I choose books I want to engage in, and I have the skills to do so. I'm hoping from these 2 sessions you've learned this is not rocket science. Teaching decoding is easily enough accomplished with some basic strategies. And teaching comprehension is really about things you already know how to do. How much of today were things you basically knew how to do? Right? I may have given you some more structured ways, maybe some, I hope I gave you some ideas of other ways to do it, but I don't think most of this was you pretty well, yeah, I mean, I've got that basic idea. What makes a difference in comprehension instruction is doing it systematically, regularly, and enough that it develops the habit. Because the problem is oftentimes we do this, but the student did it once or twice. About the time the student has been doing something every day for a couple of months, they really do begin to comprehend the text. One of the things I thought is interesting, in the CBL classrooms, in the juvenile halls, they often have substitutes that come in. And often the substitutes don't know the process, so they start teaching the lesson any way they want. And what I find interesting is the kids will stop them and correct them and say, no, we do the word wall this way and we do it first. No, you haven't done the timeline yet, we can't start reading. And the subs will often be offended, and then I'll explain to them, you don't understand. The kids have figured out what works for them. They know that if they do this in this order, they can understand the text and do it. And what they're doing is now they've learned to ask to be taught in a way they can learn. That's really a huge sign of progress for the kids. And so it's interesting when you think about the comprehension process. We want students to be the owners of their own learning, right? We want you to be the person in charge of your learning. Reading comprehension instruction is about strategies that get people to take that over so they can do it. How can we do that? Well, force them out of their dysfunctional reading habits. That's what the impress method is for. Get them to read the text more closely. That's what the close technique can help us to do. For God's sakes, ask some questions that make them think. We learned about lots of questioning strategies we can use. Do anything that gets them to spend more time with the text. Apps can be wonderful for that. But most of all, think about the activities that force comprehension to take place. And you have lots of examples of them in the material today. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate and honored by the fact that after all else that's happened to you today, you're still here. In 2 weeks, I'm going to talk about mathematics computation. And what I'm going to be talking about is less stressful ways to do math problems if math is a difficult area for you, and some of the things we can do that makes math more possible for students who have difficulty. See you then.
Thank you.